Joining us virtually for the next session on how trade fuels sustainable and inclusive development, we have Ms.Anna, Economist at World Bank, who will share her insights on how trade, policies, and global market access contribute to sustainable and inclusive development. This session will highlight how trade can serve as a catalyst for Sri Lanka's long-term growth. Please give a round of applause as Ms.Anna joins us virtually.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm assuming I'm audible. Okay, I'm just going to continue. So thank you so much for this invitation to talk at this forum. I'm really sad that I couldn't be there in person, but I think this topic is very important and very timely. And considering the ongoing global discussion on what 2025 holds for trade, in many ways, despite the conversations that are going on now, and maybe the fear that trade is under attack, I think what we can definitely say as fact is trade is an important part of the development story. And hopefully in this presentation, I can convince you of that. Also bringing in the experience of Sri Lanka, talk about how trade can contribute to the economic ambitions of the nation, and also be honest about not just the pros of trade, but also the downsides, which can be mitigated, in my opinion, through just carefully structured public policy interventions. So I'm going to start by just giving you an overview of international trade since the 1990s. And the key message here is that international trade has expanded rapidly. As you can see on the graph on the left side, in 1995, trade to GDP ratio was around 20%, and that increased quite substantially in the 90s and in the early 2000s to around 30%. And a big part of that was fueled by something that we call global value chains, which I'll talk about a bit more later on. And now, coinciding with this increase in international trade was a decline in poverty. So we saw countries increase global exports from 16% to over 30%. And in the graph on the right, you can see the poverty headcount line decline from around 40% in 1995 to around 10% in 2022. Now, of course, we could argue that a lot of things have impacted the decline in poverty, but later on in the presentation, I will provide evidence that points to trade being a big part of that story. And this rise in international trade also coincided with a decline in tariff and non-tariff barriers. So here, looking at the average applied tariff rates globally, so simple average, trade-weighted effective average, and the MFN average, we can see all three lines decline. And this is happening at a time where the WTO is incorporated in 1995. We also have countries, primarily developed countries, reducing their protections, opening their supply chains to offshoring. We also have the China and East Asia effect playing a huge impact. And what we see is also a change in international trade costs. So on the left, you can see across the main sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, and services, there were declining costs. And trade costs here, what we're talking about is the logistics costs, so shipping and road costs, as well as other trade costs related to trade facilitation. So this kind of overall increase in trade was a combination of multiple aspects, as I've shown. And now, beyond correlates, what I want to move on to is the discussion on how trade has enhanced growth, incomes, and productivity. So in the World Bank Development Review in 2020, which focused on global value chains, there was an analysis that showed the impact of participation on global value chains on income growth. This is the graph on the left-hand side. There have also been gains to labor productivity from trade on the right-hand side, as you can see. And the headline message is basically that although countries have not benefited equally, what we can see in the data is that trade has generated, and the wording in this report was unprecedented prosperity. And it's been connected to helping around 1 billion people out of poverty. And I'd like to add that women have benefited as well. There is literature showing how women in particular benefit from trade because it opens up manufacturing and the services sector, which are big employers of women. And so this is one aspect that definitely needs to be highlighted here. Before I go further, just also to share some unique features of the global trade dynamics that we've seen over the years. And that is around 40% of the current world trade is between developed countries. And, this is actually quite a decline from what it was earlier. And sorry about that, I have some background noise. And currently between developing countries, it's around 25%. Another feature of global trade is that the size of your country and also your distance from major trading partners is a big determinant in your export potential. But there are other things that come into play that shouldn't be ignored. It's the common borders, issues around language, even former colonial ties shape trading relationships. What sort of free trade agreements governments negotiate also matter. And we also see trade following immigration flows and cultural ties. The third point I would like to make on this unique feature of global trade is that, I like to think of international trade like technological change. So you have a country that can essentially increase its consumption, can generate growth and improve incomes by trading. And this creates winners and losers. And it's also worth highlighting that sectors contract and expand as countries navigate this global trading system. And, over time, like I said, this word, GVCs, global value chains, has become a big part of the trading story. And they've powered trade growth over the past 3 decades. And what do I mean by global value chains? This is essentially the idea that a production process is fragmented across different countries. And a key feature here is hyper-specialization. So you can see the graph on the slide, and it's a picture on the slide, and it's a picture of a bicycle. And this bicycle shows exactly what GVCs are. The saddle on the bicycle, comes from China, the frame from Vietnam or Italy, the brakes from Singapore, the wheels from France, and then the pedals from Japan as well. And each of these components are sourced globally in order to manufacture a bicycle in, let's say, the United States. And today, almost 50% of global trade is in this thing that we call global value chains. And it provides an opportunity for a country like Sri Lanka, because instead of specializing in an entire value chain, there is an opportunity for Sri Lanka to insert itself in one aspect of a value chain, hyper-specialize, and reap the gains from trade. In our report, we also find out that when there's an increase, a 1% increase in global value chain participation, we see incomes per capita go up by more than 1%. And this is twice as much as conventional trade. So, initially you had countries engaged in trade like commodities, right? So Ghana, for example, would export gold to the UAE, and that's that. But there is now this entirely evolving aspect of trade, the global value chain trade, that's becoming a big part of the story. And I think when we think about how Sri Lanka can leverage trade, it's important to also acknowledge that this GVC aspect has a lot of potential for Sri Lanka. And when it comes to GVC participation, there are three things that have been shown in the literature to matter: endowments, institutions, and trade costs. And I'm showing two graphs on the screen. On the left-hand side, you're looking at the impact of endowments on institutions, on how countries are participating in global value chains. And the only thing you need to take away from that graph is that all the lines are on the positive side, which means, if you have a good stock of capital, a good stock of skilled labor, good institutions, predictable institutions, and maybe you also have the bonus of having natural endowments, you're actually in a good place to participate in global value chains and increase your participation. On the right-hand side, though, is tariffs. And these are, capturing trade costs. And there what we found in our study is that tariffs have a negative effect on how countries are participating in global value chains. And this is very, very important for the case of Sri Lanka, which, across the board tends to have higher tariffs than the average country. You have to be careful about your tariff structure because it does weigh on how effectively or intensely you're participating in global value chains. And these are across input, market access, and output tariffs. And I'll talk a bit more about this in later slides. So in summary, GVCs, I believe, can continue to be a force for sustainable and inclusive development, but there are a few things. First, I think developing countries like Sri Lanka need to speed up trade and investment reforms. And you've heard discussions on the business environment in this forum, or you might discuss them in the next coming day, but this is critical. Second is that advanced economies also have a role to play, and they need to be open and predictable. And unfortunately, in this uncertainty around the policies and appetite of advanced economies for championing trade. But even in this uncertainty, I think countries like Sri Lanka can navigate. Third, countries need to strengthen social and environmental protection. I think what's emerging globally is that aside from just encouraging trade, countries are increasingly interested in how that trade is impacting social and environmental indicators. And developing countries can't be left behind. They need to rise to the occasion and make sure that they're available and able to contribute to sustainable trade. So now I've sort of set the scene around the evolution of trade. I've hinted at how trade is supporting growth. And I just want to pause now and show how Sri Lanka measures up. And the key message here is, as the world has increasingly opened itself up to trade, and even though there have been bumps in the road, especially since the financial crisis in 2009, the shocks of the COVID pandemic on supply chains, and also the geopolitical challenges we're having, Sri Lanka has been moving sort of in the opposite direction. It's becoming more inwardly oriented. The graph I'm showing you now shows trade as a share of GDP. It's one of the indicators we use to just ascertain how open a country is, and that's been in decline. Another picture here shows you the same message. The share of Sri Lanka in global and regional trade has also been declining, not only just in South Asia, but also among lower middle income countries. And this is concerning because, as I will show, Sri Lanka is essentially not participating in the gains to trade, and other countries are. And in a sense, we could argue that Sri Lanka is then being left behind. Now, even though when we digged into the data, exports of services are growing faster, again, the main message here is that trade overall is in decline. And also the diversification of Sri Lanka's trade has been on the low side. And, in combination with the low participation in trade and low export diversification, we've now seen that Sri Lanka has become more sensitive to shocks because of its over-reliance on services. And this was evident in the impact of the pandemic on the export economy of Sri Lanka. On the tariff side, like I showed you earlier, tariffs are very important for how countries participate in trade. And the message here is that Sri Lanka has one of the highest averages in terms of tariffs. And you can see on the slide a few comparator economies, Vietnam, Malaysia, Bangladesh. And here again, Sri Lanka is on the high side, and also includes a unique feature around para-tariffs, which are additional duties on top of statutory tariffs. And now no export sector is safe. You will see on the right side that all sectors are suffering. You know, the tariffs are between 10 to 20% for some sectors. And these are tariffs on inputs. This is concerning because I think there is a tendency for people to think of import tariffs as, you know, a problem that doesn't really affect exports. The thing is, across most economies, exporters are one of the biggest importers. They need inputs from other countries in order to produce a product and export it. Now, if tariffs are high on these inputs, you now have a higher cost of production, and it makes it very difficult for countries to be competitive in terms of their exports on the global stage. So import tariffs are just not an issue for, you know, an average Sri Lankan who wants to buy a watch, right? They impact the Sri Lankan firm that is looking to import inputs in order to export. And so currently in Sri Lanka's tariff structure, we have what I would call an anti-export bias. And without reforms, it's very difficult to see how we can really put Sri Lanka at the forefront of export competitiveness. So now in the next part of my presentation, I just wanted to dive into what I see to be sort of the channels of trade impacts on welfare. And here I'm hoping to present insights from economic literature to kind of make these points. Because I think a lot of times the debate is devoid of evidence. And so here, hopefully you can take away some nuggets of information. So when we think about trade impacts on welfare, we look at it from two channels, the income channel and the consumption channel. So the income channel would be, you know, how much revenue do we generate from exporting or trading with other countries? And the consumption channel would be when we open up to the global economy, how much do our citizens, so how much do Sri Lankans benefit from enjoying products that are cheaper from other countries? And now there are some papers in the literature that point to that. So Artuk and al. In 2019, they conclude that the majority of middle-income countries would still be better off by reducing protectionism. And Arctic and Donaldson in 2015, they find out that lower trade leaves many of the most rural consumers without welfare gains, meaning even consumers in rural areas benefit from trade. However, it's not all rosy, and I think it's important to acknowledge the potential negative impacts of trade. And first is around labor outcomes. In lower and middle income economies, it is possible without the right policies in place for trade to have some negative impacts. So for example, research has shown that in districts in India, when these districts opened up to trade, parents actually took their children out of school in order to cope with the increase in prices. There's also a paper from Atkin written in 2016. He looks at dropout rates in Mexico along the border with the USA. When trade opened up, there was an increase in dropout rates from high school because kids wanted to work in the factories that were exporting to the United States. There are also trade impacts on global emissions. And this has been shown in studies, for example, in Mexico, where as a result of trade, there's been an increase in waste and battery recycling in Mexico. And this happened because the United States imposed more stringent environmental measures domestically, and so domestic firms just started exporting this waste to Mexico. Now, even though it's not all rosy, my big point here is that protectionism is not the answer. I think there are many ways to address it, but the reality is identifying the losers is always much easier than the winners. So we should not fall into the trap of arguing that trade is bad just because of the negative effects. I think it must be taken holistically, and what we find in the literature is that trade is growth enhancing. Also, these studies I shared are context specific. They might not apply to Sri Lanka, and that must be acknowledged. And there are also issues around identification and measurement, and these effects can be complex and again require just detailed research. So again, key message here is that protectionism is not the answer. I think having in this global economy an economy that's open to trade is again growth enhancing, welfare enhancing. It's pro women, and it's also pro poor, which I hope to continue to convince you of in the next slides. So the reason I say protectionism is not the answer is that if you close up your economy, you are not benefiting from very important spillovers from exporting. And here I highlight some of these spillovers. And it's coming again from a list of papers that have been done on this topic. They're listed on the slide. I encourage you to read and look into them if you have the time. And these studies have found positive effects on exporting on the productivity of low and middle income countries. There was a study from Slovenia which showed that learning by exporting has actually increased the productivity of firms. In a study in Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, the authors find that the marginal costs of firms decline by about 20% for new exporters. And this points to the productivity gains that come from firms interacting with foreign entities and exporting. Another spillover comes from foreign direct investment. A lot of times to encourage exports or when you open up, there is an inflow of FDI. And here the benefits come from the interaction of foreign MNEs with domestic firms. Domestic firms tend to learn more efficient production techniques. Also, when these foreign firms hire local labor, the local labor learns a lot of skills that they can then take into domestic companies. Again, listing a couple of experiences from countries around the world. In Bangladesh, there's been backward linkages that have been connected to FDI. In a paper by Khalifa and Adam in 2009 and another paper in 2017, they found out that when firms are closer to FDI firms, they are more productive. And this comes from the learning and knowledge loop that I discussed. There's also been evidence that as you open up to FDI, there are technology upgrades that help with knowledge spillover and competition. And in a paper done by Abebe and al., they find out that in Ethiopia, that benefit is around 11% in terms of productivity for local plants. And this is non-trivial. There's also evidence that's been done across country. And here they find out that increased hiring, total factor productivity, and sales increase from these connections between local firms and foreign firms. So let's look at the numbers on FDI in Sri Lanka then, right? If, I've presented all this evidence that shows the benefits of FDI, how is Sri Lanka doing? And here the key message is that there are missed opportunities. FDI flows in Sri Lanka it's below peers, as you can see from the graph. And also the FDI tends to be concentrated in services. So when you have a combination of low FDI and narrowly focused FDI, you are limiting your ability to benefit from trade and from the presence of foreign firms in this sort of knowledge enhancing loop that I've mentioned. So now I've talked about the channels where trade can support growth. I've talked about its impact on welfare, incomes, consumption. I've talked about the benefits of trade to firms. There's spillovers from exports. There's spillovers from FDI. There's a lot of learning that happens. So now I want to talk about what sorts of policies can be implemented and what sort of environment is necessary to reap these trade gains. And I'm going to start with trading infrastructure. Now, this is a term that just broadly includes things like roads, rails, air infrastructure, but it also includes the intangible infrastructure like communication and IT system. And what the literature shows is that there are significant impacts to getting physical infrastructure right in order to benefit from trade. And what we've seen is that, there are multiple countries globally where firms identify transportation as one of the constraints. And Sri Lanka is very tiny in this graph, but that's also the case in Sri Lanka. Maybe not as terrible as other countries, but that's a major constraint as well. So I'm going to take each, bucket of infrastructure separately. Roads and railways, they've been shown to matter. So again, there was another paper that showed that a $1 investment actually led to a 0.7 to $2 improvement in exports. Historically, the railway projects in India have been connected to decreased trade costs and trade. There's also been work that's been done in Argentina on the railway network. Here again, it's been linked to this process of structural transformation that happened. However, I just wanted to state over here that in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, these results might vary and they might be considerably different depending on the context. And this also applies to Sri Lanka. But the key message here is broadly, there's agreement that roads and railways can be trade enhancing. Now, beyond land, let's look at infrastructure that's sea related. So around 90% of the world's trade transits by sea. So that already makes the case for why any policies to improve maritime infrastructure can be transformational. So again, another paper by Nordis and Pierre Martini, they find out that when you improve the quality of your ports, there's a significant impact on bilateral trade flows. Air travel is also important. There are two studies here that I highlight, and they basically show that when foreign companies are quite close, not quite close, they say about 6,000 miles in distance, that the quality of the air travel infrastructure matters. Communication infrastructure is also key, and there was a study that looked at transatlantic telegraph lines, also concluded that this enhanced exporters, particularly by allowing exporters the opportunity to find out about foreign market conditions through the internet and to acquire information on how to trade. This would not be possible without communication and IT infrastructure. And I think as we see services exports expand, IT infrastructure is even more important for sectors like business process outsourcing, for software development. And here there is potential for Sri Lanka, like other neighboring countries have taken advantage of. Another area, there's infrastructure, but there's also customs collection and trade facilitation. When goods need to be exported or imported, typically you need to go through some sort of customs process. The issue here is that if you have an inefficient customs system, you are in effect adding an extra cost to trade. A paper that was done in 2010 estimated that each day of delay, so each day that a firm has to spend navigating either exporting or importing a product, it corresponds to increasing the distance between the firm and the destination market by 70 kilometers. And this again is non-trivial. And also, given that the average time to clear exports for many developing countries is much higher than European Union, which is around 3 days, what you can conclude is that countries are actually further away than they physically are from their trade partners. In sub-Saharan Africa, some countries see delays of 11 days. In South Asia, it's between 7 to 15. So this is an area of concern. I think any policy reforms to reduce the time spent on customs and trade facilitation can really unlock trade. So again, going back to Sri Lanka, where do we stand? And here, unfortunately, Sri Lanka performs quite poorly on trade facilitation. We have comparator economies on this graph: India, Thailand, Malaysia. And we can see quite systematically that Sri Lanka underperforms compared to these other economies. So there's a lot of work to be done here. And on the customs and trade facilitation side, there are many things that have been suggested as potentially important, measures to put in place, strict rules on how to evaluate product prices. Some researchers argue that you can outsource shipment inspections, for example, which is a big area of delay, to private firms, financial incentives for customs agencies, and developments in technology are all possible policy reform and sort of initiative areas that can be considered. In Sri Lanka's case, national single window, using technology to enhance customs trade facilitation in itself can be quite catalytic. On export promotion, here, what we found globally is that states can play a very important role in helping firms access export markets. And this is because of something called search frictions. Now, because it's very hard for firms to communicate with each other sometimes, to understand what a market needs, these search frictions can really limit how much firms in a country are exporting. And there's a large body of evidence around the existence of these search frictions. This idea of collective reputation is very important because of the sort of distance between, let's say, Sri Lanka and a country like Australia. If they are buyers interested in buying Sri Lankan products, a lot of that relationship relies on something called collective reputation. What is Sri Lanka known for? Are they known for quality, like Germany? Are they known for speed, like China? Or are they known for innovation, like, let's say, the United States or Chile? That collective reputation can really impact even firms in Sri Lanka that are high quality exporters. And without the proper branding, without the proper export promotion, without a very solid standards, compliance, and quality infrastructure, that collective reputation can really weigh on export potential in Sri Lanka. And this is seen in research that's been done by Machiavello, Boudreau, and also in conjunction with Machiavello as well in 2023. Also, there's new evidence that shows that South Korea's success story, actually, a lot of it relied on how effective the state was in export promotion. And so there's a lot to learn from that example. I think, for me, when I was a kid, I remember very, very clearly the Malaysia Truly Asia tourism promotion campaign. And this is non-trivial. Over the years, research has shown that these kind of very targeted, very impactful branding, export promotion programs can be very catalytic for trade, not just in services, but even for manufacturing products. And let me motivate this point a bit more by also going back to the data on Sri Lanka. The graph you see in front of you is an index of export market penetration graph. It shows you, for the products that Sri Lanka is exporting, what is the extent of the markets that import that product that Sri Lanka is reaching. And the message here is that compared to other countries, that export market penetration is low. And it can be for a number of reasons, but export promotion is one of those. And so any policies, at the national level in defining a made in Pakistan, a made in Sri Lanka brand, and also supporting firms in this branding activity would be important, while also ensuring quality. So now the final part of my presentation is around why trade and why protect. And this is explicitly looking at industrial policy as a tool to boost trade. This is a very, very hot topic right now. It is a question that many countries have in mind, especially around this push to grow and to trade sustainably and in a green way. And just to summarize, industrial policy, it's simple. It looks at how governments are using instruments in order to support a sector or an industry, and it typically has a national objective. So a country might identify the manufacturing of cars as an important sector for them, and they might want to support it. Many countries do this for their air sector, their air travel sector, if they want to set up a national airline. Countries also might focus on manufacturing if that's part of their agenda. And there are many reasons for this, right? The idea is that industrial policy can fix some of the market inefficiencies in a sector. So perhaps in a sector, there is information asymmetry, there are issues around finding the finance needed to boost the sector. There might be also issues around finding the finance to support research and development in a sector. And here the government might decide that they want to step in. And there are various tools that they use. It can be financial incentives, tax breaks, subsidies, export bans, import tariffs, local content requirement. The list goes on. And the classic experience of industrial policy has been around East Asia. So we can think of South Korea's protection of the chemical sector. In the USA, traditionally, it's been the manufacturing sector as a whole. Most recently, there's been a conversation in the US on how to use industrial policy to support electrical vehicles. And an increasingly large and kind of solid literature is emerging around it's not the question of whether to do industrial policy or not. The question is actually how to do it. And so here I am presenting a few things to think about to help sense check this question of when to use industrial policy, the pros and the cons. So industrial policy can be very useful when, like I said, there are information externalities, there are coordination issues within a sector. The government might believe that a country has a latent comparative advantage in a sector. So you can think of a country like Rwanda. It has a quite large population of gorillas. And the government decided that they would provide government support for the tourism sector around gorillas because of this unique advantage they have in that niche area of tourism. There might be environmental externalities, knowledge externalities that exist, which kind of limit private sector input or private sector participation in a space. The government might want to come in. And also they might decide that, if we invest in research around electric vehicles, that knowledge can spill over into other sectors in the renewable economy. And there's a win-win for the private sector as a whole. But then we need to exercise caution because the literature has also shown that industrial policy can be distortive. Depending on the tool you use. So for example, tariffs versus production subsidies, you might be having a negative impact on the environment, on the business environment. And also industrial policy, it tends to be prone to capture. So because the government is deciding to deliberately intervene in a sector, in some cases you have private interests lobby interests coming in to define what that government support might look like. And support from government tends to be costly. And so then you also have it weighing on the fiscal position of a country. And so these decisions have to be done very carefully. They have to be based on rigorous evidence. The international best practice is that whatever interventions government does needs to be time bound. The private sector needs to be able to thrive on its own without that support. And most importantly, I think whatever industrial policy is put into motion, there should be transparency, continuous evaluation of this industrial policy, and room for course correction if there is a misalignment between what the government was hoping to achieve and what the industrial policy tool or the trade promotion tool is actually leading to. So in the case of Sri Lanka, this also holds. I'm new to the region and from specific examples, but I think this would resonate with many of you in the audience that are well versed and really steeped in this area of discourse. So now my last slide. I'm just going to end on some of the key recommendations that the World Bank has put forward for Sri Lanka around really boosting export competitiveness. And they are in 3 buckets. And these buckets really follow the structure of what I've presented so far, the various points that I've made. On tariffs, I think the key message there is to reduce the tariffs and para-tariffs in the tariff structure, particularly prioritizing inputs for exports. And I made the case that exporters are also importers, and any tariff that they deal with affects how competitive they are. Also, recommendations around implementing a digital VAT refund system would be key, really making sure that firms are getting their refunds in a timely manner, because a lot of firms are cash strapped, and so that kind of timely refund system would really help them on that front. And also, because of the tariff structure, there is this duty remission scheme that helps exporters kind of get some tariff relief. Again, these schemes tend to benefit larger firms than smaller firms, so simplifying, improving access, digitizing could be quite impactful. On trade facilitation here, national single window port community systems, fully electronic submission of processing of customs declarations are the way to go. And again, time and time again, this has been shown to be important in other country contexts. And I would wager that this would be the same for Sri Lanka. And finally, on FDI, again, like I mentioned in my previous slides, there's spillovers from FDI that Sri Lanka is unfortunately not benefiting from because of its low rate of FDI. Here, removing foreign investment restrictions on services, negotiating deep free trade agreements, and operationalizing the ETA are certainly recommendations that could really help boost FDI. So thank you. That's actually the end of my presentation. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you, but hopefully you've taken something away from this presentation, and I've kind of supported this idea of trade being a good driver of growth that's sustainable and inclusive. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Twum, for your insightful presentation. And as you stay with us online, we will be now moving on to the Q&A session. Over to you, Tierney.
All right. So for the first burning questions, let's have our audience raise our hands. We are only allowing 1 question because we have limited time. Any questions from the audience? No? Very quickly, then I'll move on to the Slido. The first question, Ms. Twum, is that in Sri Lanka, most free trade agreements don't fully achieve its intended goals and is almost impossible to implement as tariffs are difficult to remove. Why is this the case?
That's a good question. I think it starts with how these free trade agreements are negotiated. So, negotiation, it's a skill. It's not something that governments should take lightly. And in the different contexts I've worked in, I have seen very often that these free trade agreements are not really as free as they're supposed to be. They're kind of used as diplomatic, symbolic tools of engagement with other countries when they should in fact be, practical and actionable ways of increasing trade with other countries. And so I think it really starts with the negotiating capacity of the government. And I know the World Bank has provided the government support in free trade agreement negotiation. And I think continuing to build capacity in that area would be the first step in really making sure that these free trade agreements are working for Sri Lanka. Another thing is, it's a fallacy to think that you sign a free trade agreement and the trade flows. That's not the case. There's a lot that needs to be done on firm productivity, market access, really informing firms about the opportunities that exist. And this goes to making sure that the trade portal is working and updated effectively. Firms know how to use these different avenues for getting information adequately. So it's quite a basket full of reasons why these free trade agreements tend not to be impactful.
That's a great answer, Ms. Twum. So given the short time period that we have, we'll have to wrap out this Q&A. Over to you, Tomali.
Thank you, Ms. Twum, for joining us virtually.